Thank you, sir. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm just waiting for a few more participants to join in. How was your break? Your meeting after a long break after Diwali vacation. Hope you had enjoyed your festivals. Good afternoon, Om Krishna. Good afternoon, Swati. Okay, have you, apart from holidays, taken your books and studied something? Were you able to devote some time on our topics? Good, very nice. Because the objective of studies is that it always be studies, and objective of festival is to celebrate and then come back, right? So can't be a long term celebration. So yes, I've seen few responses saying that yes, they have studied. Very nice. I'm happy to know that. Revised and practiced. Very nice. Very good. Okay. So we had completed most the registration aspect in our last chapter, in our last session. So today we will be discussing on what is a tax invoice. Okay, we'll be dealing with various aspects of the tax invoice. It's a very lengthy topic, but we'll try to cover up in this session because it involves newer aspects also, right? So we had seen time of supply. So that time of supply, you'll see a kind of repetition over here because when should tax invoice be issued? Then apart from tax invoice, there are other documents also which is relevant under GST. So what are those documents? When should they be issued? That also we will discuss. Good afternoon, Arjun, Swati, Bhumika. Very good. Good to see you all. So we'll start with tax invoice. Okay. Now, as usual, any doubts you have, you just put it in the chats. Every half an hour, I'll take up the question so that we are in the flow as well. So what do you think generally to understand the invoice? We know what is an invoice because uh, we always use the thing, but let's understand invoice and then I'll ask you a question. Let me know what you think about it. Firstly, what is an invoice? Very simple. It's a commercial instrument which is issued by the supplier to a recipient, right? So whenever there is a transaction, to prove the transaction and to document that, we issue an invoice. So general sense, apart from GST, normal understanding of invoices, it's a commercial instrument which is issued by the supplier to the recipient. It is under GST law, section 31 also mandates that you have to issue an invoice or a bill of supply, which means what? That law also recognizes the importance of section 31 and it says that you have to issue a tax invoice under section 31 and where you are not charging GST, there you have to issue a bill of supply. If you are charging GST, very good. There you issue a invoice or a tax invoice. And in case they are not charging any tax, issue a bill of supply. It is an essential document from a perspective of the recipient also, because recipient has to avail the credit. In input tax credit, we understood the various requirements for claiming the credit. One of the requirements was this, that the recipient should avail the ITC basis the invoice itself. If he has the invoice, only then he can claim it. Apart from other conditions, there are totally 6 conditions. One of the conditions was that he has to have the invoice to claim the credit. And then invoice as such, section 31 says that you have to issue an invoice, but it doesn't give the format of the invoice. It just says that these are the important criterias and important conditions. These conditions you fulfill and then your invoice is done. You don't have to follow any particular format. Whatever format you want, you can use it. But what is my requirements under the law that I have told you? Based on that, you issue your own invoice. Now, the question what needs to be discussed over here is uh, in case of a transaction, which is a supply transaction, I have completed the transaction of supply. Now I have not raised the invoice. So this is the background that I have made a supply, but I have not raised the invoice. So since I have not raised the invoice, so I have not collected from my customer. So my question is the liability to pay GST still there or not there? You understood my question? I am supplied something. It qualifies as a supply. I have completed the transaction. Customer to the customer, I have not issued the invoice, and customer has not paid me GST. Now, should I pay GST on that transaction or no? Good afternoon, Ms. Komal. What about others? What are you thinking? Swati is saying should pay GST. Bhumika is saying no. Om Krishnom is saying yes, GST is payable. Okay. So the correct answer is yes, GST is still payable. Whether you collect GST from your customer or you do not collect, that is your responsibility or that is your burden, which you can reduce it. But without this, also you cannot say that no, that it is not a supply. You can't say that because I have already told it is a supply. Once it is a supply, then you cannot refrain from yourself saying that no, scope of GST is not applicable. The scope or the main crux of the GST, which is the charging section, is attracted. So charging section is attracted, so it is liable. Now, if you do not collect from your customer, then you will pay it from your own pocket. So there is no option that you cannot you just say that no, I've not collected, so I cannot pay. If you collect from your customer, you will reduce your burden. Okay. If you do not, then you will have to pay it from your pocket. So invoice helps you to collect the money from the customer. If you do not collect money from the customer, still supply and all other conditions are fulfilled. Okay. So you just cannot say that I have forgotten to issue invoice. I have delayed the invoice, so I will not pay. Invoice is one of the documents which proves that supply is completed. But apart from that, in principle, if supply is completed, all other transactions are there, then goods have moved, then GST has to be paid. Invoice only attaches or gives a conformity saying that, okay, supply has been made. Without that, that doesn't mean that no supply is not made, GST is not payable. Still, GST would be payable. Okay. Now, moving on. Now, when should you issue the invoice? Right? We have seen under time of supply that what is the time of supply for goods and what is the time of supply for services. Now, what is the time limit for issue of invoice? This also we have briefly touched there. In case of supply of goods, where the supply involves movement of goods, then before removal of the goods, your invoice should be raised. Okay. So law says that, okay, invoice has to be raised. Now, when should invoice be raised is given in section 31, which says that the time limit for issuance of invoice is where the supply involves movement of goods. Then before the removal of the goods, you have to raise an invoice. And in case of other than movement, it is delivery of the goods or making the goods available. Before that point of time, invoice should be raised. Now, what happens if invoice gets delayed? Then then your time of supply also will shift. Correct? So, but you will discharge the liability on the basis of your invoice which you're raising. But the time for issuance of invoice is this itself. Now you have done a movement, you have issued an invoice. So fine, the invoice date will be treated as the relevant date for payment of GST. But if you have made a supply and you have not raised a invoice, अगर आपने इनवॉइस टाइम पे रेज नहीं किया, तो फिर उसका नतीजा क्या होगा? टाइम ऑफ सप्लाई आपका इनवॉइस डेट नहीं कहा जाएगा, बिकॉज आपने इनवॉइस रेज इशू किया है. तो फिर एक्चुअल मूवमेंट ऑफ गुड्स कब हुआ है, दैट विल बिकम द टाइम ऑफ सप्लाई. So that becomes very complicated. That's why, as a abiding taxpayer, you should follow this option of system of issuing a invoice on a timely basis. So when the invoice is for supply of goods, before the supply happens, before the goods are removed, you should raise an invoice, which generally everybody follows. Just to clarify, saying that, okay, that few people may say, no, I've not received the payment, so I will issue the invoice late. No, you may receive the amount for your sales later on. That is fine. But GST time of supply for issuance of invoice is on the removal of the goods. And in case where the goods are not removable, it is already there. We have seen various examples, right, where the goods are already there at the customer's location, when it is already dispatched, and now you are only changing the hands in terms of pele you had supplied the goods as a hire purchase. So the goods were there with the customer. Now, after the hire purchase term, you agree that you want to sell the goods are already there with the customer. In that case, before the delivery takes, you have to raise a invoice, because there it does not involve movement of goods. Goods are already moved and they're at the customer's location. So in such situation, where you give the delivery of the goods or make those goods available to the customer, before that you have to raise a invoice. That is for goods. Now for services, what is the time limit for issuance of invoice? Within 30 days from the date of supply of service. Now, what is the date of supply of service is not defined under the law, because it is very difficult to define. For services, when is the date for supply of that service which is complete, which is not determinable. You have to prove that how is the service completed. So if it is consultancy services, once you give your report, that is the time of supply. Once you are an auditor, okay, you're appointed as an auditor, you once you give your audit report, that is when the supply of service is deemed to be completed. So similarly, these situations we'll have to go as per each service basis, saying that when is the supply of service completed. Okay, so it says within 30 days from the date of supply of service, you should raise the invoice. As soon as you do the service, you cannot raise the invoice. So unlike goods, wherein before removal, we will issue the invoice, but for supply of services, 30 days time you have from the date of supply of service where you should raise the invoice. And in case of insurance, banking company or NBFC, they give extra 15 days time. So within 45 days, they should raise the invoice. And there is another condition which says that in case of a insurance, banking company, NBFC or a telecom operator, where there is a taxable supplies between distinct person, then the in case of these entities where there is a supply between distinct person, which means that there is a transaction in a bank from one branch to another branch. So that is treated as a distinct person. So when there is a transaction between one branch to another branch, The time of supply for issuance of invoice is recording in the supplier's book. Okay, because they don't raise an invoice, they'll just record it in the books before recording in the books of the supplier or before the expiry of the quarter. So if you're recording in the books on an annual basis, so time of supply will get delayed from quarterly and go to annually. So government will get revenue very late. So that's why they're saying that in case of a taxable supplies between distinct persons who are in this industry of insurance companies, banking companies, NBFC, and a telecom operator, then the quarterly at least you should raise the invoice. If you are recording in your books of account in less than a quarter, that is fine. But if you are not recording in the books on a quarterly basis, you are recording it on an annual basis, then quarterly basis you have to determine and raise a invoice. So that is the time of supply, time of issuance of invoice for services. Okay. So that is when you will raise your invoice for goods and for services. Any doubts in this? Because this is the basic. Once we understand this, then we can go to the next aspects. Clear. Very nice. In case of normal supply, we saw that. Now, in case of continuous supply of goods, we know we just reproduce the definition so that if you have forgotten it, we'll just clarify that. Continuous supply of goods means a supply of goods which is provided or agreed to be provided continuously or on a recurrent basis under a contract wherein supply of goods happens on a continuous basis through one of those means, one of the modes, that is either wire, cable, pipeline, or any other conduit for which supplier invoices the recipient on a regular or periodic basis. Saying that, okay, there is a pipeline. At the end of their full consumption, I'll raise the invoice. That's not possible. There is a pipeline. And on a periodic basis, invoice is being raised. And it includes supply of such goods as the government may subject to such conditions by notification specified. And what is continuous supply of services? Continuous supply of services means a supply of service which is provided or agreed to be provided continuously or on a recurrent basis under a contract for a continuous period of 3 months. Because for supply of goods, there is no obligations and include supply of such services which the government may specify. So, specific generally what we understood when you're supplying continuously over some instrument, that is supply of goods, continuous supply of goods. And when you are providing for, in case of services, if you're providing a contract or a kind of retainer for a period of more than 3 months, then that is supply of services. Now, what is the time for issuance of invoice? In case of continuous supply of goods where there are successive statement of accounts or successive payments are involved, because goods, one of this has to be there, that you either say that, okay, monthly you have to pay me this much, or you will say that when I give you a statement, that time you have to make the payment to me. So for goods, you will have one parameter or at least one guideline कि आपको इस टाइम पे पे करना ही है. When you decide that, okay, this is the guideline, then once that milestone is reached, could be that, okay, monthly you have decided, or you have decided within 45 days, or there is a monthly payment you have decided. Then once you decide that, that will become the time of supply for issuance of invoice. Before or at the time of each installment is issued or payment is received. Each statement, not installment, sorry, statement. Once you issue the statement or once you receive the payment, whichever is applicable, before that you have to raise an invoice. Simple for goods. Now for services, when there is continuous supply of services, the due date of payment is ascertainable from the contract. If you can ascertain from the contract, saying that in the contract they've said monthly this is the payment, or they say once in 45 days we'll make the payment. So there is a fixed definition saying that, okay, basis this payment mode, we'll make the payment. So before that due payment date, you have to make the payment. Or where the due date of payment is not ascertainable from the contract, then when the supplier of service receives the payment. When the payment date is not ascertainable, but on a some understanding basis, there is receipt of payment by the supplier. So before receipt of that supply payment, you have to issue the invoice. Or in third instance, is where the payment is linked to a completion of an event. Okay, when you have house construction, this is a typical example we had given, right? जब आपको फ्लैट बनाने का एक कॉन्ट्रैक्ट आता है and you have a contract saying, okay, each floor wise you will complete it. Once you complete first floor, that is one milestone completed. So it is an event, right? That event is completed, so you will get a bill for that. So when each payment event is completed, then before completion of that event, you have to raise an invoice. So this is the timeline for continuous supply of goods or continuous supply of services. Okay. Now, before proceeding further, let me take a count over here that how many of you are comfortable with Hindi? Or do you want me to stick in English itself? Om Krishnam, you can unmute yourself.
Yes, sir.
Yes, please tell me what is your question.
Sir, I was giving my opinion that I am okay in both the
Okay.
languages.
Okay, got it. Swati is saying one language itself. Okay. Okay. So there'll be recording also. So we'll stick on to English itself so that there is no kind of confusion. Just one moment. Okay. So Swati saying, okay, she can understand. ठीक है ना? So it'll be comfortable for me to tell it in Hindi and English. And wherever you're not able to understand, please message. I will be okay to repeat it in English. ठीक है? क्योंकि क्या होता है जब हम हिंदी में समझेंगे तब ठीक रहेगा हमारे लिए। ठीक है। नाउ कंटिन्यूस सप्लाई ऑफ गुड्स का समझ गए हम लोग, कंटिन्यूस सप्लाई ऑफ सर्विसेज का समझ गए हैं। इसमें कोई दिक्कत ही नहीं है, क्योंकि कंटिन्यूस सप्लाई ऑफ गुड्स में तो ठीक है व्हेन देयर इज सक्सेसिव स्टेटमेंट ऑफ अकाउंट्स या फिर सक्सेसिव पेमेंट्स आर इन्वॉल्व, वो ठीक है। नाउ इन केस ऑफ कंटिन्यूस सप्लाई ऑफ सर्विसेज, वहां पे तीन सिनारियोज हो सकते हैं। जब आपको टाइमली पेमेंट आ रहा है और आपने अपने कॉन्ट्रैक्ट में क्या है, पेमेंट का ड्यू डेट आपने स्पेसिफाई कर दिया है। सेकेंड केस में आपने पेमेंट तो असरटेन नहीं किया है लेकिन आपको टाइमली पेमेंट मिल रहा है, तब उस पेमेंट के पहले आपको इनवॉइस रेज करना है। थर्ड इज, अगर कुछ इवेंट स्पेसिफाई किए हैं कि मैं आपको कुछ काम करके दूंगा, सपोज मैंने एक घर पे कंस्ट्रक्शन फर्नीचर वाले को बुलाया है, उसको बोल दिया कि जब तुम टेबल खत्म करोगे तब मैं आपको 10% दूंगा, जब आप टीवी स्टैंड करोगे तब मैं 20% दूंगा, जब आप रूफ कर दोगे तब 30% दूंगा। सो ऐसे आपने अगर डिसाइड कर लिया है, तो जब जब वो माइलस्टोन फिनिश हो जाएगा तब तब आपको पेमेंट करना पड़ेगा। और जब जब आप पेमेंट तब करेंगे तब उसके पहले आपको इनवॉइस रेज करना है। ये बोलता है कंटिन्यूस सप्लाई ऑफ सर्विसेज। नाउ इन केस ऑफ व्हेन गुड्स आर सेंट ऑन अप्रूवल बेसिस, सो जब आप गुड्स अप्रूवल बेसिस पे बेचते हो, करेक्ट, कि आपका सेल कंफर्म नहीं हुआ है, कस्टमर जो है वो डिसाइड करके आपको देगा, तो आप सप्लाई सिर्फ भरोसे पे कर रहे हो, यू आर ओनली सप्लाइंग इट ऑन अ बेसिस ऑफ ट्रस्ट। एंड वंस द कस्टमर कंफर्म्स दैट ओके आई एम रेडी टू बाई, then you will raise a invoice. Correct? So when at the time of giving it to the customer, it is not a confirmed sale. Once he confirms, that will become a sale. So when the buyer approves, that will become the time of supply. और buyer अगर सो गया है तो फिर आप नहीं सो सकते हो, आपको 6 महीने के अंदर इनवॉइस रेज करना है। आपको फिर ट्रैक करना पड़ेगा जो जो गुड्स आपने अप्रूवल पे बेचे हैं, कब भेजा है आपने, उसके लिए आपको तब डिलीवरी चालान देना पड़ेगा, बिकॉज यू आर नॉट इशूइंग अ इनवॉइस, तो गुड्स लेके क्या जाएगा, एनी मूवमेंट ऑफ गुड्स शुड बी सपोर्टेड बाय अ डॉक्यूमेंट। विदाउट डॉक्यूमेंट्स आप कुछ सप्लाई नहीं कर सकते हो। तो इनवॉइस ही एक डॉक्यूमेंट होना ये जरूरी नहीं है, इससे हम पता चल जाता है। इनवॉइस कब रेज करेंगे, जब सेल क्रिस्टलाइज हो गया है। लेकिन जब हम अप्रूवल बेसिस पे बेचते हैं तब सेल क्रिस्टलाइज नहीं हुआ है, सेल कंफर्मेशन नहीं हुआ है। ठीक है, तो देन व्हेन व्हाट विल यू डू इन दैट केस, उस केस में क्या करेंगे, व्हेन इट इज सेंट ऑन अप्रूवल बेसिस, विद इन 6 मंथ्स कस्टमर को कंफर्मेशन देना है। अगर 6 मंथ्स में भी वो कंफर्मेशन नहीं दे रहा है, तो जीएसटी बोलता है आपको इनवॉइस तो रेज करना है। 6 महीने के ज्यादा जीएसटी भी वेट नहीं कर सकता है। सो इधर 6 मंथ्स और 6 मंथ्स के पहले ही अगर कस्टमर अप्रूवल दे देता है, तो फिर ऑन दैट अप्रूवल बेसिस विच एवर इज अर्लियर। ठीक है, नेक्स्ट। नाउ पर्टिकुलर्स ऑफ अ टैक्स इनवॉइस, क्या बोलता है जीएसटी, सीइंग दैट ओके आपको कुछ स्पेसिफाइड पर्टिकुलर्स देने पड़ेंगे एक इनवॉइस में। जैसे हमने पहले बताया था, इनवॉइस का कुछ फॉर्मेट नहीं है। इनवॉइस में क्या है, इनवॉइस में सिर्फ कहा गया है कि दीज पर्टिकुलर्स आर इंपॉर्टेंट, क्या क्या चीजें चाहिए इनवॉइस में वो जरूरी है। क्या क्या चीजें लिखी है, फर्स्ट बताया गया है कि नेम, एड्रेस एंड GSTIN ऑफ द सप्लायर। तो आपका डिटेल्स तो पहले होना चाहिए, नेम, एड्रेस एंड GSTN ऑफ द सप्लायर, इनवॉइस नंबर, इट शुड बी अ कंसेक्यूटिव सीरीज नंबर नॉट एक्सीडिंग 16 कैरेक्टर्स। आपके इनवॉइस नंबर के कैरेक्टर्स कितने होने चाहिए, 16 कैरेक्टर्स से ज्यादा नहीं होने चाहिए। इन वन और मल्टीपल सीरीज, आपको एक ही सीरीज मेंटेन करना ये जरूरी नहीं है, आपको मल्टीपल सीरीज मेंटेन कर सकते हो। 2-3 तरह के सेल्स बुक रख सकते हो, एक यहाँ पे जो मेन हेड ऑफिस में रहेगा, एक ब्रांच ऑफिस में रहेगा, एक गोडाउन में रहेगा, ऐसे 3 अलग सीरीज मेंटेन कर सकते हो आप। और अगर आपका बिजनेस अलग अलग फ्लोर पे है तो हर एक फ्लोर में अलग अलग इनवॉइस सीरीज हो सकता है। सो मल्टीपल सीरीज ऑफ इनवॉइस यू कैन मेंटेन, ऐसा नहीं है कि एक ही इनवॉइस बुक रहना चाहिए, बिकॉज योर बिजनेस इज सो वास्ट। आप अलग अलग सीरीज मेंटेन कर सकते हो, लेकिन इस सब का रिकॉर्ड्स आपको गवर्नमेंट को देना पड़ेगा। जब आप मंथली फाइलिंग करते हो GSTR 1 में, तब आपको हर सीरीज का स्टार्टिंग नंबर, एंडिंग नंबर देना पड़ेगा। ठीक है, इन वन और मल्टीपल सीरीज कंटेनिंग अल्फाबेट्स, न्यूमरल्स, स्पेशल कैरेक्टर्स, hyphen, dash or any combination is also possible. डेट ऑफ इट्स इशू, मतलब डेट ऑफ द इनवॉइस तो डालना पड़ेगा व्हेन यू आर जनरेटिंग द इनवॉइस. इफ रिसिपिएंट इज रजिस्टर्ड तो फिर नेम, एड्रेस एंड GSTIN ऑफ द रिसिपिएंट, क्योंकि GSTIN डालेंगे तब हम जब GSTR1 में अपलोड करेंगे तब वो GSTIN मेंशन कर पाएंगे. अगर हम GSTR1 में कस्टमर का आइडेंटिफिकेशन, कस्टमर का GST नंबर मेंशन करेंगे तभी उसको GSTR2B में दिखेगा, तब वो उसका क्रेडिट ले पाएगा. अगर हम उसका GSTI नंबर नहीं लेते हैं या फिर गलत नंबर डाल देते हैं तब उसको क्रेडिट नहीं मिलेगा. सो वी हैव टू बी केयरफुल कि जब आप किसी कस्टमर को सेल करते हो उसका GSTI नंबर करेक्ट से लो. ठीक है. देन इफ द रिसिपिएंट इज अनरजिस्टर्ड तो फिर मुझे GSTI नंबर डालने की जरूरत नहीं है. लेकिन क्या बोल रहे हैं, वेयर द टैक्सेबल वैल्यू ऑफ सप्लाई इज 50,000 एंड अबव, अगर 50,000 के ऊपर है, नेम एंड एड्रेस ऑफ द रिसिपिएंट एंड एड्रेस ऑफ डिलीवरी, ये तो लिखना पड़ेगा. 50,000 के ज्यादा आप सेल कर रहे हो, सामने कस्टमर का एड्रेस और नाम पता नहीं है, ये गलत बात है. तो इसीलिए आप अगर 50,000 के ज्यादा सेल करते हो तो नेम एंड एड्रेस ऑफ द रिसिपिएंट इज रिक्वायर्ड. और 50,000 के नीचे है तो फिर रिक्वेस्ट द aforesaid डिटेल्स टू बी रिकॉर्डेड. अगर आपको मेंशन करने की कंपल्शन नहीं है, लेकिन अगर कस्टमर बोलता है नहीं मेरा नाम और एड्रेस डालिए तो फिर आपको डालना पड़ेगा. देन HSN कोड ऑफ गुड्स और सर्विसेज, वी आर अवेयर ऑफ दिस. HSN और SSE कोड वो मेंशन करना पड़ेगा. देन डिस्क्रिप्शन ऑफ द गुड्स, HSN मेंशन कर लिया फिर भी डिस्क्रिप्शन क्यों मेंटेन करते हैं, क्योंकि एक HSN में मल्टीपल डिस्क्रिप्शन हो सकते हैं. तो इसीलिए यू हैव टू पुट द HSN एंड द स्पेसिफिक डिस्क्रिप्शन. जैसे जब मैं कुछ मेटल पार्ट सेल करता हूँ तब वो एक HSN में है, और अब वो सेम मेटल को मेरा कट के वेस्ट हो गया है, सो इट इज अ स्क्रैप फॉर मी. सो आई विल स्टिल यूज द सेम HSN, लेकिन मेंशन करूंगा मैं मेटल स्क्रैप. तो ये ठीक से मेंशन करना है, क्योंकि अभी आपने देखा रिसेंट न्यूज में कि मेटल स्क्रैप के ऊपर TDS लगेगा, TCS लगेगा, लेकिन नॉर्मल मेटल बेचने पे आपको TCS नहीं लगेगा. सो योर HSN एंड डिस्क्रिप्शन बोथ आर वेरी मच इंपॉर्टेंट. देन क्वांटिटी इन केस ऑफ गुड्स एंड यूनिट और यूनिक क्वांटिटी कोड देयर ऑफ. क्या क्वांटिटी पे आप बेच रहे हो, क्या मेजरमेंट कर रहे हो. अगर आप लिक्विड बेच रहे हो तो लीटर पे बेचोगे, तो यू हैव टू मेंशन द नंबर ऑफ लीटर्स. if it is in kgs then you'll mention in kgs. Yeah, any other measurement जो है that you'll mention. Then total value of supply, then taxable value of supply, taxable value जिसके ऊपर you will charge the tax on what rate, so rate of tax is important. Then amount of tax charge, क्योंकि tax तो मेन collection है गवर्नमेंट का, so आपको value भी डालना है, फिर tax charge and the tax value you have to mention. Then place of supply, very important. Place of supply आपको mention करना है, because if the place of supply is in same state you will charge CGST and SGST. if it is in a different state you will charge IGST. so place of supply mention करना बहुत जरूरी है. एड्रेस फॉर डिलीवरी, ओके. सो कस्टमर का एड्रेस अलग हो सकता है, डिलीवरी एड्रेस अलग हो सकता है. वेरी मच पॉसिबल. व्हेन इज इट पॉसिबल, यू टेल मी. ये वाला पॉइंट करेक्ट. बिल टू शिप टू ट्रांजैक्शन में जब मैं बिल किसी को करता हूँ, शिप किसी और को करता हूँ, इन दैट केस इट इज पॉसिबल दैट बिल टू नहीं है, बिल टू शिवा, इट इज बिल टू, BILL, बिल टू एंड शिप टू. when it is billed to one person and shipped to another person, that time it is possible that address of the delivery will be different than the address of the invoice. Then where the tax is payable on reverse charge basis, whether the tax is payable. If you say no, then you will only charge. If you say yes, tax is payable under reverse charge, then you will not charge the GST. The receiver will discharge the GST on that. Few, this is very important, because as a matter of again reporting in your GSTR1, you have to mention the invoice and you have to click whether the recipient is liable to pay reverse charge on it. Even by mistake, if you mention it, then the customer will be at a trouble, because once it highlights in its 2B, then the officer will always tell him that, see, the supplier has mentioned it. But you will tell, no, supplier was not supposed to mention, he's mentioned it mistakenly. Government बोलेगा नहीं हमको नहीं पता. Just because supplier has mentioned, you have to discharge the GST on it. Okay. Then signature or digital signature of the supplier or his authorized representative. Either physically sign करो या फिर DSCP है. One of those mates you have to sign it. ओके. उसके बाद क्या डालना है आपको? सिग्नेचर, एड्रेस ऑफ डिलीवरी, वेदर टैक्स इज पेबल अंडर रिवर्स चार्ज. साइन करना है आपको, फिजिकल साइन कर सकते हो या फिर डिजिटल साइन कर सकते हो. इधर ऑफ दिस इज पॉसिबल. आप फिजिकल साइन हो तो फिजिकल साइन कर सकते हो, लेकिन आपका डीएससी यूज करना है तो आपका डीएससी भी यूज कर सकते हो. देन लास्ट वेरी इंपॉर्टेंट पार्ट, क्यूआर कोड. कॉल्ड क्विक रेस्पॉन्स कोड डालना है आपका, विच इज not for purpose of payment. This is a special QR code which is having embedded invoice reference number in case of a e-invoice has been issued in the manner prescribed under Rule 48.4. So Rule 48.4 specifies the requirement of e-invoice, जहाँ पे आपको पूरा data e-invoice पे डालना पड़ेगा. From that data, a QR code gets generated. That QR code also you have to put it in your invoice. लेकिन हम कर रहे हैं क्या? हम नहीं कर रहे हैं. Few small companies, because the limit is there. If you are below that limit, then you don't have to generate a QR code. If your previous year turnover exceeds certain limit, okay, then you will have to mention this QR code. Now, what is this QR code? It is an embedded QR code which has invoice reference number in it. Invoice reference number कहाँ से आता है? E-invoicing portal से आता है, wherein you will have embedded e-invoice reference number in case e-invoice has been issued. Now, e-invoice had said that somebody has to issue. Who will issue? There is a limit. All registered person with aggregate turnover in the preceding financial year from any of those years from 17, 18 onwards, किसी भी साल में आपका टर्नओवर अगर 10 करोड़ क्रॉस हुआ है, then you are liable to raise e-invoice. Okay, so all registered person whose aggregate turnover is in the preceding financial year from 2017-18 exceeds 10 crore rupees, then you are required to raise a e-invoice. This declaration, I'll come to that later. So this is the basic preliminary requirements what an invoice should have. ओके. नाउ द लॉ सेज दैट ठीक है, अगर आपने इतने सारे डिस्क्रिप्शन नहीं मेंटेन किए, if you do not, you're not mentioning all of those details in your invoice, at least mention the following minimum requirements. What is this? Mention the GST and of the supplier and the recipient. Mention the description of the goods. What is the total value? What is the amount of tax charge? What is the place of supply? These are the minimum requirements we should have. Of course, इसके ज़्यादा जो हमने उस एक वर्ड डॉक्यूमेंट में देखा था, all of that, if you mention it is well and good. If you cannot mention all of that, then you mention at least these basic requirements. ठीक है. So this is the requirement of what invoice should contain. Now HSN, we had mentioned here, no, that in the previous slide that HSN has to be mentioned. Now, how many characters of HSN you will mention? Because we have totally 8-digit number in the HSN tariff book. But the law says that if your turnover is above 5 crores, then you give me for B2B supply for up to 4 digits, and for B2C supply, you can give or you don't have to give. It's an optional thing. But for B2B supply, you have to use specifically 4 digits of HSN. And for where your turnover is less than 5 crores, then you have to, no, sorry, I'm saying the other way around. If your turnover is less than 5 crores, B2C optional, B2B up to 4 digits, above 5 crores, both for B2B and B2C supplies, uniformity 6 digits you have to mention. Okay, so up to 5 crores, kitna HSN mention karna hai? 4-digit HSN numbers. Okay, and if it is Exceeding 5 crores, then 6 digits of HSN has to be mentioned. Clear till now? HSN and description of the invoice. Okay. So we understood HSN also. Next is how many copies of invoice you should raise in a normal scenario. You should, where there is no e-invoice, because अगर e-invoice हो गया तो फिर आपको 3 कॉपी इशू रेज करने की जरूरत ही नहीं पड़ेगी. If you are not liable for e-invoice, you're still a small trader, you're below 10 crores worth of limit, then what you will do, you will issue triplicate, that is 3 copy of invoices in case of supply of goods and 2 copy of invoice in case of supply of services. Because in case of goods, third one goes to the transporter, but in supply of service, there's no transporter involved. So only 2 copies is enough. One for the supplier, one for the receiver. Okay. Then there is a concept of revised tax invoice. Okay. What do you mean by revised tax invoice? कि आपने एक बार invoice raise कर दिया, उसको revise करना है. So say I have made a sale of 10 lakh rupees. ठीक है? It should have been 10 lakh 10,000 rupees होना चाहिए था, but I've just say 11 lakh for better understanding. It has to be 11 lakhs, but I've raised invoice for 10 lakhs. So now can I revise the invoice? Swati, amendments also we will go. We will go through the study material. We'll see what are the relevant amendments. Om Krishna is saying, yes, 10 lakhs was the thing. Now you want to revise to 11 lakhs. Yes, yes, go revise it, sir. Swati is also saying, go revise it, sir. क्या हम ऐसे इनवॉइस रिवाइज कर सकते हैं? Did you get my question? Very few have responded. Two people are saying yes, one person is saying no, one person is giving another opinion. Okay, so let's dwell in what can happen in case of a mistake in the invoice. If you had to raise 11 lakhs, but you have raised 10 lakhs, 10 lakhs तो आपने raise कर दिया है. Now you cannot amend or revise that invoice. Why? Because the invoice is already given to the customer. So you cannot revise that invoice. What you can do is for the differential of how much is the difference value? For the difference of 1 lakh, Siva is saying correctly that yes, for this difference, sir, you have to raise a debit note. Okay, because your value was 11, but you have raised for 10. Matlab 1 lakh rupees additional tax is payable. So you have to raise a debit note for this 1 lakh rupees. But you cannot revise your invoice. So then, sir, what is this revised tax invoice? Yes, this is a special case where it says that where the registered person who has been granted registration, okay, who has been granted registration from a date earlier than the date of issuance of certificate of registration may issue the revised tax invoice, where a person who has granted registration with effect from a earlier date. So he has applied for registration today. He got the registration after 30 days. But so then that should be the date of effective start of the business. But no, if you are voluntarily applying, when you're applying where it is requirement of law that you're crossing the limits, then you will have to apply from the date from where you're crossing the limits, because sometimes it is possible that you might have forgotten and you will apply it late. Correct? So even if you apply late, he said that yes, where the registered person has granted registration, he's applied it on time. So the officer who's issuing the certificate, he'll mention that certificate issue date is today, but applicable from 30 days from backwards, because that is the date when I have applied for it. So in such cases only you can revise the invoice. That is, you have got a registration certificate for an old date and you have actually got the certificate in hand late. Then for that interim period, you can issue a revised tax invoice because you have known that you have crossed the 20 lakhs. No, you didn't want to pay it from your pocket. You want to collect it from the customer. You have collected it. But in that old invoice, you didn't have the GSTIN number. Correct? Now you have received the GSTIN number, so you can include it and issue a revised tax invoice. समझे आप लोग कब रिवाइज टैक्स इनवॉइस रेज कर सकते हैं? जब मैंने रजिस्ट्रेशन के लिए अप्लाई तो कर दिया है, टाइमली अप्लाई कर दिया है और मेरा बिजनेस चल रहा है, करेक्ट? तो फिर जब मैं अप्लाई करता हूँ, जब तब तक मुझे रजिस्ट्रेशन सर्टिफिकेट आता है, तब गैप हो जाता है। तो उस दौरान जो भी आप बिजनेस करते हो, उसके लिए आपको ओरिजिनल टैक्स इनवॉइस को रिवाइज करके रेज करना पड़ेगा। And this revised tax invoice should be issued within 1 month from the date of issuance of certificate of registration. आप इसे डिले नहीं कर सकते हो, आपको 1 महीने के अंदर इश्यू करना है revised invoices. Then a registered person may issue a consolidated revised tax invoice in respect of supply to an unregistered person. क्योंकि unregistered person को तो credit claim नहीं करना है, तो they said that when you are supplying to an to unregistered person, तो फिर आप consolidated revised tax invoice raise कर सकते हो. Then, however, in case of interstate supply, a consolidated will cannot be issued when you are making a interstate supply और value 2,50,000 के ऊपर है. तो क्या बोल रहा है? फर्स्ट आपने इनवॉइस रेस कर दिया है, अभी आपको रजिस्ट्रेशन सर्टिफिकेट मिल गया है, अब आप जो भी इनवॉइसेस रेस किए हो ड्यूरिंग दिस इंटरम पीरियड, उसको आप रिवाइज कर सकते हो. फर्स्ट, अगर आप रजिस्टर्ड पर्सन को सप्लाई करते हो तो फिर ईच इंडिविजुअल बेसिस पे आपको रिवाइज्ड इनवॉइस रेस करना है. अगर आपने अनरजिस्टर्ड पर्सन को सप्लाई किया है तो फिर से आपको चेक करना पड़ेगा कि ये जो अनरजिस्टर्ड पर्सन है विद इन द स्टेट है, तो फिर आपको ईच इनवॉइस वाइज या कंसोलिडेटेड भी रेस कर सकते हैं फॉर एनी अमाउंट, क्योंकि अनरजिस्टर्ड पर्सन विद इन द स्टेट है. अभी अनरजिस्टर्ड पर्सन आउटसाइड द स्टेट है, तो आपको इंटर स्टेट इनवॉइस रेस करना है. अप टू 2,50,000 रुपीज का आप कंसोलिडेशन कर सकते हो, अबाउट 2,50,000 का आपको इंडिविजुअल इनवॉइस रेस करना पड़ेगा. ठीक है? वो सामने वालों को क्रेडिट नहीं मिलेगा, बट स्टिल द लॉ सेज दैट this is what you have to do in case of a interstate supply. Got it? Then non-issuance of tax invoice. अरे बाप रे, हमने तो अब तक तो सर E-invoice turnover limit 5 crores or 10 crores. Sir, madam, for your exams, it is still 10 crores itself. 5 crores will come now. It is not yet implemented. So it is still 10 crores only. नॉन इश्यूएंस ऑफ टैक्स इनवॉइस, सप्लाई तो कर रहा हूं लेकिन इनवॉइस रेज नहीं कर रहा हूं, तो एक्ट सेज कि ऐसा भी कुछ होता है. एनी आइडिया ये क्या हो सकता है? Supplier issuing revised invoice can take ITC on the basis of revised invoice. हाँ, since the receiver को क्रेडिट मिलना चाहिए, that's why we are issuing a revised invoice. तो सप्लायर को तो वैसे भी क्रेडिट मिलेगा ही. जो मैं सप्लाई कर रहा हूँ किसी को और उसको रिवाइज्ड इनवॉइस रेज कर रहा हूँ, उसमें मेरा जीएसटी नंबर रहेगा, सो ही कैन क्लेम द क्रेडिट. No claim ITC. What is this, Swaroop? What is no claim ITC cases? Okay. Yes, correct answer, Om Krishnom. Correct answer, Shoaib. There are instances where in tax invoice is not required to be raised when your a registered person may not issue a tax invoice if the value of the goods are less than or services both goods or services less than 200 rupees है या recipient unregistered है and the recipient does not demand such invoice. ठीक है, वो लेके जा रहा है, बस उसको invoice भी वो नहीं पूछ रहा है. ठीक है. In such cases we can issue a, instead of giving small invoices, you can give a consolidated tax invoice for all supplies which is made at the end of the day. आप एक daily consolidated tax invoice raise कर सकते हो wherein the value of your supply is so very less कि आपको एक एक invoice raise करने की जरूरत है और customer भी पूछ नहीं रहा है. Then you can raise a consolidated tax invoice. No claim of credit, correct. Where the recipient is unregistered, he is anyways not claiming. In such cases, you can issue a consolidated tax invoice. लेकिन अगर कोई पूछ लेता नहीं मेरे को क्रेडिट चाहिए भाई, तो उसको आप अलग से एक इनवॉइस दे दोगे, उसको कंसोलिडेशन में ऐड नहीं करोगे. बिकॉज देन कंसोलिडेट में ऐड कर लिया देन बिकम डबल काउंटिंग. सो जो अनरजिस्टर्ड सप्लायर को दे रहे हो, हु इज नॉट आस्किंग यू द क्रेडिट, हु इज नॉट आस्किंग यू द इनवॉइस, उसका एक कंसोलिडेटेड इनवॉइस. और जो पार्टीज ने आपसे नहीं हमको स्पेशल इनवॉइसेस चाहिए बोले हैं, वो आपको अलग से मेंटेन करना पड़ेगा. As a customer, is it good to always ask invoice? Yes, for multiple reasons. If you want to claim the credit, firstly, if you want to claim the benefit of some expenses, because under Income Tax Act also you can claim the benefit of the value of the expense. In such cases, it is better to ask. But if it is value is less, then it is not required. When it is for your personal use, not for business, their invoice may not be required because you're not going to get any benefit from that. All the conditions, yes, Shoaib, all the conditions has to be satisfied. If all the three conditions are satisfied, only then you will stop issuing a tax invoice and issue a consolidated invoice. All the conditions has to be satisfied. So this is the instance, only instance when there is no need of issuance of tax invoice. Bill of supply. The bill of supply can be issued in two instances when a registered person supplies exempted goods. Okay, कि वो तो सप्लाई कर रहा है लेकिन एग्जेम्प्टेड गुड्स का सप्लाई कर रहा है, वो टैक्स तो चार्ज नहीं कर रहा है, तब मैं उसे टैक्स इनवॉइस कैसे कह सकता हूँ? बिकॉज टैक्स इनवॉइस में तो टैक्स रहना जरूरी है. करेक्ट. सो अगर मैं एग्जेम्प्टेड गुड्स में डील करता हूँ, देन मैं टैक्स इनवॉइस रेज नहीं करूंगा, मैं रेज करूंगा बिल ऑफ सप्लाई. Okay. So when I'm supplying exempted goods or services, there this requirement of bill of supply is there. I will not issue a tax invoice. Second is when I am paying tax under composition levy. We know that under composition levy, the supplier cannot collect the tax. So in such scenario, but the recipient, okay, also will not get the credit because he's not paying tax to me and he will not get the credit. So in the second instance also you can issue a bill of supply. So when you are making exempt supply or supply with under a composition levy, then you will issue a bill of supply. What all will the bill of supply contain? It will contain the name, address, and GSTN of the supplier, consecutive serial number not exceeding 16 characters. Of course, like how we have tax numbers, here also you can have multiple series, but the character should not exceed 16 characters. Date of issue of the bill of supply. Recipient, if is registered, then his GSTN number and other details, HSN, description of the goods, value of supply, and signature, value of supply, description, HSN, and the signature. So is there a major difference between normal invoice and bill of supply? Not much. Both of the contents are same. बट इशुएंस ऑफ दैट इज वेरी इंपॉर्टेंट हमारे. ठीक है. सो दैट इज द कॉन्सेप्ट ऑफ बिल ऑफ सप्लाई. Yes, there is a star which says that if you supply both taxable and exempted, then you can issue a mixed document called as invoice cum bill of supply. The cum means and. It's kind of invoice and bill of supply. दोनों है इसमें. When you're supplying both taxable and exempted goods to a unregistered person, because if you're supplying it to a taxable person, he will ask for a tax invoice. If you're supplying it to an unregistered person, then you can issue a invoice come bill of supply. Content of invoice required Shoaib to understand that, saying okay, what are all the things which is compulsory. URD Om Krishnam is a unregistered dealer. URD का full form है unregistered dealer. Then next document is called as a receipt voucher. Once you issue an invoice, then you will get the money. So what you should issue? You should issue a receipt invoice. When you receive advance money, तब आप इनवॉइस तो रेज नहीं करोगे, लेकिन टाइम ऑफ सप्लाई ट्रिगर होगा या नहीं होगा? इज जीएसटी पेएबल ऑन रिसिप्ट ऑफ एडवांस और नो? No, sir. Only when it is utilized, then GST is payable. What do you mean by utilized, Swati? Correct. Particulars of invoice come bill of supply shall be same as of a invoice or bill of supply. It will be same of a invoice, because invoice will have more content. So whatever are the content of a invoice, that will apply to it. No, Swati. To which goods advance is attributable when it is utilized, then only GST will be? No. So when you receive a advance, tax is payable if it is supply of service. But if it is supply of goods on advance, GST is not payable. So when GST is payable in case of supply of goods, only on receipt issue of invoice. So once you issue the invoice, that is when GST will become payable, not on receipt of advance. But irrespective of this, you still have to issue a receipt voucher, because सामने वाले को confirmation चाहिए ना that you have made the advance payment. So you will issue a receipt voucher where you will mention the contents of name, address and GSTN of the supplier. Again consecutive series number, like जैसे invoice number होता है वैसे receipt voucher का भी अलग से series number होना चाहिए. Date of issue, if recipient is registered, फिर उसका details, description, amount of advance taken, rate of tax. Rate of tax and amount of tax charge will come only if it is services. For goods it will not come. Place of supply, where the tax is payable on reverse charge basis, and signature. For this, so this is very simple कि आपको कभी भी एडवांस आता है तब आपको रिसिप्ट वाउचर देना पड़ेगा. नाउ रिसिप्ट तो आप दे रहे हो, लेकिन यहाँ पे रेट ऑफ टैक्स भी मेंशन किया है. सो व्हाट रेट ऑफ टैक्स विल यू स्पेसिफाई? और कस्टमर ने पेमेंट कर दिया है लेकिन आपको पता नहीं कौन से स्टेट में है, तो देन व्हाट विल यू डू? विल यू चार्ज IGST or CGST? And if the description of the services or description of goods you don't know कि वो एडवांस किसके लिए दे रहा है, राइट? तो फिर आप कौन सा रेट चार्ज करोगे और कौन सा स्टेट के लिए चार्ज करोगे? Correct. You will charge if given, then that, otherwise 18%. Very nice. So you will charge 18%, and if the state where it is not determinable, then we will consider it as a IGST transaction. We'll consider it as an interstate transaction and charge it. Because at the time of receipt, if you don't know, you cannot tell you will not charge anything. You will still charge. The rate will be 18% and it will be a interstate supply. और फिर जब इनवॉइस रेज होगा तब ये एडजस्ट कर लोगे. नाउ रिफंड वाउचर आपने रिसिप्ट कर लिया है और सप्लाई नहीं हुआ. Where on receipt of advance payment with respect to any supply of goods or services, both the registered person issued receipt invoice, but subsequently no supply is made and no tax invoice is raised, तो फिर आपको refund करना पड़ेगा. So for this refund also there is a document. Advance के लिए receipt voucher और refund के लिए refund voucher. He will issue a person who has made the payment a refund voucher against such payment. Okay, means what? You are the supplier and you have a recipient. जब आप वो एडवांस पेमेंट कर रहा है तब हम उसको रिसिप्ट वाउचर दे रहे हैं. रिसिप्ट किस लिए हमने एडवांस लिया है? सप्लाई करने के लिए. लेकिन उसने बोला नहीं, आपका प्रोडक्ट मुझे नहीं चाहिए, तो फिर हम सप्लाई भी नहीं कर रहे हैं और टैक्स इनवॉइस भी नहीं कर रहे हैं. तो ये जो एडवांस आया है उसको रिफंड करना पड़ेगा. ये उसको रिफंड करेंगे थ्रू रिफंड वाउचर. एडवांस के लिए रिसिप्ट वाउचर और रिफंड के लिए रिफंड वाउचर. अगर सप्लाई कर दे तो वहीं पे सप्लाई इनवॉइस रेस करके, सप्लाई करके टैक्स इनवॉइस रेस कर देते. लेकिन हमने यहाँ पे टैक्स इनवॉइस रेस नहीं किया है, रिफंड दे दिया है, तो रिफंड वाउचर देंगे. ठीक है. नाउ इनवॉइस एंड पेमेंट वाउचर्स और रजिस्टर्ड पर्सन. यहाँ पे हमने पिछले साइड में क्या देखा है? रिसिप्ट वाउचर और रिफंड वाउचर. अभी हम पेमेंट वाउचर का देखेंगे, which means a registered person who is liable to pay tax under reverse charge basis, then I will have to issue a payment voucher because supplier जो है वो taxable नहीं है. He might be registered क्योंकि सेक्शन 9 सबसेक्शन 3 में रजिस्टर्ड पर्सन के सर्विसेज पे भी आपको रिवर्स चार्ज पे करना पड़ेगा. A typical example is a advocate services. Advocates providing you a service, he may be registered under GST, but GST तो आपको ही पे करना पड़ेगा. तो आपके पास डॉक्यूमेंट्स रहना चाहिए. So when you make payment to him, you have to issue a payment voucher at the time of making payment to the supplier in respect of goods or services received under reverse charge. And in case of reverse charge, invoice and payment voucher has to be issued. आपको invoice भी raise करना है और payment voucher भी raise करना है. Because for the payment, you will raise a payment voucher, and to claim credit, you will raise a self invoice. GST में ये concept बड़ा नया है, wherein on any supply on which receiver has to pay GST under reverse charge, there he will raise a self invoice. Okay, so we will raise a self invoice and make a payment voucher. That is normal cases. Now 9(4) cases mein we have discussed this, when a builder or promoter उसका बेनिफिट क्या है, बिल्डर और प्रमोटर को क्या जीएसटी रेट अप्लीकेबल है? व्हाट इज द जीएसटी रेट अप्लीकेबल? 12%? अरे बाप रे। कोमलप्रीत जी, both are required. Payment voucher and invoice both are required to be raised. Correct. Shoaib has given a correct answer that for a builder rate 12% नहीं है ओम कृष्णो, रेट है 1% फॉर अफोर्डेबल हाउसिंग एंड 5% फॉर नॉन अफोर्डेबल हाउसिंग। ठीक है, सो दो रेट है। दोनों रेट में कंडीशन ये है कि वो इनपुट टैक्स क्रेडिट नहीं ले सकते हैं। करेक्ट। और एक कंडीशन है दैट एटलीस्ट 80% ऑफ हिज परचेजेस शुड बी फ्रॉम registered person. ठीक है, so if a builder purchases less than 80% of the inputs and input services from registered person, then जो भी शॉर्टेज है उसका उससे रिवर्स चार्ज पे करना पड़ेगा। दैट जो भी, क्योंकि अगर बिल्डर पूरा अनरजिस्टर्ड से परचेज करेगा तो फिर गवर्नमेंट को लॉस होगा। बिल्डर क्या सोचेगा कि मैं जो भी अनरजिस्टर्ड से जितना परचेज करूं उतना अच्छा है मेरे लिए, क्योंकि मेरा टैक्स बच जाएगा, क्योंकि मेरे को वैसे भी क्रेडिट नहीं मिल रहा है। टू स्टॉप कि हाँ बहुत सारे अनरजिस्टर्ड सप्लायर पैदा हो जाएंगे, गवर्नमेंट हैज पुट अ कंडीशन कि आपको सप्लाई, आपके सप्लाई के ऊपर तो आपको 5% पे करना है, और अफोर्डेबल हाउसिंग है तो 1% पे करना है, लेकिन आपको क्रेडिट नहीं मिलेगा। लेकिन आपके परचेजेस जो है 80% परचेजेस शुड बी फ्रॉम रजिस्टर्ड पर्सन। तो मैं जब 80% रजिस्टर्ड से ही लोना है, अगर मैंने फुलफिल कर दिया कि मैंने 90% ले लिया रजिस्टर्ड पर्सन से, कोई दिक्कत वाली बात नहीं है। लेकिन मैंने अगर 80% नहीं करके सिर्फ 60% रजिस्टर्ड पर्सन से लिया है, तो फिर शॉर्टफॉल कितना हुआ? हाउ मच इज द शॉर्टफॉल? 20%। करेक्ट। 20% शॉर्टफॉल है, 80 लेना था, मैंने 60 लिया रजिस्टर्ड से, 20% से अनरजिस्टर्ड से ले लिया मैंने। तो उसके लिए 9 सबसेक्शन 4 बोलता है कि देन यू हैव टू पे रिवर्स चार्ज फॉर द शॉर्टेज। तो जो भी 20% है, ऑन दैट आई विल पे रिवर्स चार्ज। सो उस केसेस में मुझे इनवॉइस भी रेज करना पड़ेगा और पेमेंट वाउचर भी रेज करना पड़ेगा। दैट इज फॉर 9(4) केसेस। सो अगर मैं सीमेंट खरीदता हूँ या फिर कैपिटल गुड्स परचेज करता हूँ, इन सब के ऊपर जो भी वो बाइफर्केशन है उसका 20% का जो शॉर्टेज है मुझे एनालाइज करना पड़ेगा। ऑफ दिस 20% शॉर्टेज, हैव आई परचेज एनी सीमेंट फ्रॉम अनरजिस्टर्ड पर्सन, या फिर हैव आई परचेज एनी कैपिटल गुड्स, तो फिर दैट अप्लीकेबल रेट मुझे अप्लाई हो जाएगा। गॉट इट? एंड इन केस ऑफ 9(3), सपोज लॉयर से आप लेते हो, इफ इज रजिस्टर्ड फाइन, अगर अनरजिस्टर्ड है तो फिर आपको पेमेंट वाउचर और इनवॉइस रेज करना पड़ेगा। ओके, सो 9(3), 9(4), दैट इज द सिनारियो। सो यहाँ पे समझ लीजिए फिर से विद प्रॉपर डायग्राम, व्हेन विल यू मेक अ पेमेंट वाउचर? व्हेन द रेसिपिएंट इज रजिस्टर्ड। आई एम द रिसीवर, आई एम रजिस्टर्ड, आई रिसीव सप्लाईज which is taxable on reverse charge basis. Then if it is under 9(3), supplier is registered, because 9(3) supplier can be registered or supplier can be unregistered. Then the recipient will issue a payment voucher at the time of making payment, because I'm making payment to a person, but reverse charge is applicable on me. So I will issue a payment voucher. And then if the recipient receives the supply, which is again taxable on reverse charge, but under 9(4) बिल्डर के केस में, तो फिर सप्लायर तो अनरजिस्टर्ड ही होगा. उन दोनों तीनों केसेस में आपको पेमेंट वाउचर इशू करना है. दैट इज पेमेंट वाउचर तो करना ही है. Invoices, when again recipient is registered, receives the taxable supply on reverse charge basis under 9(3). If supplier is registered, then he will issue an invoice. When the supplier is unregistered, then recipient shall issue an invoice. Or under 9(4), so recipient only will raise a invoice. So crux of the story is when the supplier is registered, he will issue the invoice. If the supplier is not registered, I will raise a self invoice. But payment voucher in all the three cases is required. Okay? Payment voucher, supplier is registered, supplier is unregistered, or I am paying under 9(4). In all these three situations, I have to raise a payment voucher. But in case of invoice issuance, where the supplier is registered, there I will not raise the invoice. Only if the supplier is unregistered, there I will raise a invoice. Okay. Now we have spoken so much about invoice. Now, in some specific businesses or some specific sectors, apart from tax invoice, other document what they're issuing, that is also acceptable. What is that? In case of an insurance, banking, or financial institution, all mandatory information other than serial number and address of the recipient will be there in whatever documents they issue. Correct? So consolidated invoice for a month can be issued at the end of the month. Because when a banker charges you something, then they will not give you invoice for it. It will come in the bank statement itself. So they will issue a consolidated invoice in a month. And if it's a goods transport agency, he will not give you a GTA invoice. If he gives you a consignment note, which has the details, content, how much is the weight, name of the consignor and consignee, registration number of the vehicle, details of the goods, GST and the person paying tax. If these details are there, that is sufficient. And in case of a passenger transport service, जब आप ticketing जाते हो तब आप क्या ticket में पूरा tax invoice आएगा? No, ticket in any form is also valid document if it has the serial number and address of the recipient. वो भी optional है, जरूरी नहीं है. And अगर आप theater वगैरह जाते हो, generally CA students तो नहीं जाते ना, you are very studious, so you will not know about this. Or do you know? क्या आप जब मूवी कभी भी गए होगे बिफोर बिकमिंग अ सीए स्टूडेंट, तो आपने देखा है कि थिएटर वाले इनवॉइस देते हैं या नहीं देते हैं? नेवर गॉन टू थिएटर. देखिए, कोमल प्रीत भी बोल रहे दे डोंट, दे हैव नॉट गॉन टू द थिएटर इटसेल्फ. में तो मैं ऐसे ही बोल रहा हूँ, बट डोंट टेक लाइफ सो सीरियसली. यू वुड हैव गॉन टू द थिएटर्स, तो वहां पे इनवॉइस नहीं देते हैं. दे गिव अ टिकट, सो दैट टिकट इटसेल्फ इज डीम्ड टू बी एन इनवॉइस. Okay. Again, वहां पे details of recipient डालना नहीं डालना, it's an optional thing. So in these specific cases, they're saying that because of the practice, because of the industry, they will not give a invoice. So whatever alternative documents they're giving, which contains these essential details, that is sufficient. Okay. Next is delivery challan. So invoices, continuous supply, everything we have covered. Next we'll go to delivery challan. Should we take a break here for 10 minutes now? Okay. So we'll take a break for 10 minutes and catch back at 4:25. but there is movement of goods. So any movement of goods has to be supported with a delivery challan. Now, when will you issue a delivery challan? When there is some instances has been given. Few of them are when you're supplying a liquid gas where the quantity at the time of removal from the place of business of the supplier is not known. They just fill up the containers, but they do not know what is the quantity in that. So in that case, they will not issue an invoice because quantity is not known. So they will issue a delivery challan. And then when it is refilled at the station, right, then the quantity is known, then the invoice will be issued. But for that moment, what is happening in a oil tanker or a gas tanker, when that gas tanker is moving, then it will be through an instrument which is called as a delivery challan, and that delivery challan will mention the approximate quantity, and when the actual quantity is known, that time a tax invoice will be raised. Second is in case of a transportation of goods for job worker. Now, when you do a job work, you will supply the goods, and a job worker will take the goods, do some activity, and give it back to the main manufacturer. So, this is not a supply. This is only goods given to a job worker to do the work and return it back. So, there also delivery challan will be required, not an invoice. What will be the invoice for? The invoice will be raised by the job worker for the job what he's done. Only to the extent of his job worker charges, he will raise a invoice, but for all movement of goods, delivery challan will be sufficient. Then third scenario is when in case of a transportation of goods for reason other than by way of supply. When you are supplying goods on hire purchase, the whole hire purchase, the value of the goods is not a sale. Only the higher rent is your rental. So in such cases, you will not issue an invoice, but you'll issue a delivery challan because you're not supplying the whole machinery. If you're giving it on hire, only your hire charges is a supply. So there you will issue a delivery challan. So in such instances, delivery challan will be generated. And such other supplies as may be notified by the board, wherein the no board has said that in these specific instances, delivery challan has to be raised, there we will raise it. Apart from that, any supply which you are making, which is not a which is a movement of good but not a supply, their delivery challan will be raised. Then serially numbered, same delivery challan will be serially numbered without not exceeding 16 characters. You will issue a delivery challan. Then what are the other contents? Same like an invoice, date and number, name, address, and GST and number of the consignor, then the consignee, HSN code and description of the goods, quantity, provisional, because exact quantity will not be known. In such cases, you will give the provisional quantity, taxable value, tax rate, and place of supply. Of course, this will also be in triplicate in 3 copies. Goods which are transported in semi-knockdown condition or completely knockdown condition. Like this typical example of lift, which we had discussing in the previous classes. Lift cannot be transported completely. It will be broken up into parts, and those parts are called as semi-knockdown or completely knockdown components. The supplier shall issue the complete invoice before dispatch, because before dispatch, we know that in the previous slide, we have seen what is the time of supply for issuance of goods, which involves movement of goods when you are removing from the factory. So before removing from the factory, you will raise a complete invoice. Fine. After that, the supplier shall issue a delivery challan for each of the subsequent consignment, because it's not going in one consignment, it is going in 2-3 consignments. For each consignment, you will raise a delivery challan and give reference to the original invoice. Invoice will be one, delivery challans will be multiple. If it is going in 3 trucks, invoice will be one, because ultimately it is lift. Now, for the parts, you will issue delivery challans basis on each consignment. Okay. With each of this consignment will give reference to the original invoice, and copies of the corresponding delivery challan shall accompany each consignment along with the duly certified copy of the invoice. Same copy of the invoice should be duly certified. And then the original copy of the invoice will be sent along with the last consignment so that taxes are not missed and movement of goods are evidenced through a delivery challan. Okay, so that is the procedure for a semi knockdown or a completely knocked down movement of goods. ठीक है. नेक्स्ट, जब ज्वेलरी सेल होता है, हम अपने सेमी नॉकडाउन कंप्लीटली नॉकडाउन को अच्छी तरह से समझ लिया. अब ज्वेलरी वर्क के ऊपर क्या होता है, goods may be moved within the state or from the state of registration to another state for supply on approval basis. मतलब क्या होता है, जब ये ज्वेलरी लोग होते हैं या आर्टिस्ट लोग होते हैं, वो एक स्टेट से दूसरे स्टेट में अपने साथ लाइन सेल बोलते हैं इसे, वेरिन दे डू लाइन सेल्स की, वो पूरे अपने साथ पूरे अपने प्रोडक्ट्स साथ में लेके जाते हैं, एक दुकान को बताते हैं, फिर दूसरी दुकान में ऐसे ही जितना बिक जाता है उतना बेच देते हैं. और क्या हो सकता है कि कुछ गुड्स रिटर्न भी आ जाते हैं. सो गुड्स मे बी मूव्ड विद इन द स्टेट और फ्रॉम द स्टेट ऑफ रजिस्ट्रेशन टू अनदर स्टेट for supply on approval basis, and artworks may be sent by artists to galleries for exhibition along with e-way bill. तो उस केस में क्या होगा, दो इंस्टेंस है, जब एक ज्वेलरी सेलर अपने साथ माल लेके जाता है और अप्रूवल पे कोई रखते हैं या बेच देते हैं, तब क्या रेस करना चाहिए. तब कहा गया कि ज्वेलरी कैरीड पर्सनली एंड इनवॉइस इज इशूड एट द टाइम ऑफ सप्लाई and you're not able to ascertain the value, so cannot register as a CTP. CTP is a casual taxable person. तो आप कैजुअल टैक्सेबल पर्सन के नाम से रजिस्टर नहीं कर सकते हो क्योंकि आप रेगुलरली यही बिजनेस करते हो. तो फिर आपको क्या करना चाहिए, आपको एक डिलीवरी चालान और ई-वे बिल रेस करना चाहिए फॉर द टोटल क्वांटिटी जो लेके जा रहे हो, और जितना बिक जाता है उसका आप सेल इनवॉइस रेस करोगे, और जो बाकी रिटर्न आता है उसके लिए भी आपको रिवर्स में डिलीवरी चालान और ई-वे बिल रेस करना पड़ेगा. सेम सिनारियो आर्ट वर्क में भी होगा. जब आप आर्टिस्ट अपने आर्ट वर्क को एग्जीबिशन में बेचता है तब इनवॉइस रेज नहीं कर सकता है, तो फिर एक डिलीवरी चालान और ई-वे बिल रेज करेगा फॉर मूवमेंट ऑफ गुड्स फ्रॉम हिज प्लेस टू द एग्जीबिशन सेंटर, और वहां पे जो बिक जाता है उसके लिए इनवॉइस रेज करेगा. फॉर रिटर्न अगेन ई-वे बिल फॉर द बैलेंस ऑफ गुड्स एंड डिलीवरी चालान फॉर द बैलेंस ऑफ द गुड्स रेज करेगा. सिंपल. नाउ इनवॉइस हो गया, डिलीवरी चालान हो गया, अब क्रेडिट नोट वेयर वन और मोर टैक्स इनवॉइसेस हैव बीन इशूड फॉर सप्लाई ऑफ एनी गुड्स. आपने इनवॉइस तो रेज कर दिया है, लेकिन सप्लायर ने एररलेस कुछ एरर कर दिया, हैज एरोनियसली डिक्लेयर्ड अ वैल्यू व्हिच इज मोर देन द एक्चुअल वैल्यू. 1 लाख का मुझे इनवॉइस रेज करना था, मैंने 1,20,000 का रेज कर दिया है. ठीक है, 1,20,000 20,000 का एक्स्ट्रा वैल्यू इंक्लूड कर दिया है. तब क्या करना पड़ेगा, इनवॉइस तो हम रिवाइज नहीं कर सकते हैं, तो फिर 20,000 का क्रेडिट नोट रेज करना पड़ेगा. मुझे 1 लाख करना था, मैंने 120 का कर दिया है, इसको नीचे लेके आना है तो इसको क्रेडिट नोट रेज करना पड़ेगा. तो फिर 120 माइनस 20 बिकम्स 1 लाख रुपीज, तो वो वैल्यू करेक्ट हो जाएगा. तो सप्लायर हैज erroneously declared a value or the supplier has erroneously declared a higher rate of tax. वैल्यू तो मैंने 1 लाख ही मेंशन किया है, लेकिन टैक्स मुझे 12% डालना था. मैंने नॉर्मली 18% दूसरे गुड्स पे डालता हूँ, इसके ऊपर भी 18% चार्ज कर दिया. सप्लायर जब चिल्लाया तब मुझे पता चला उफ, मेरे लड़के ने मिस्टेक कर दिया. तब उसको करेक्शन करो. क्या पुरानी इनवॉइस को आप फाड़ सकते हो, पुरानी इनवॉइस को फाड़ के नया वाला करेक्ट रेज कर सकते हैं. इजंट इट दैट सिंपलर, व्हाट डू यू से. नहीं हो सकता है, करेक्ट, यू कांट टेयर द इनवॉइस, इनवॉइस हम फाड़ नहीं सकते, क्रेडिट नोट शुड बी इशूड, करेक्ट। नॉट फॉर द रिवाइज्ड वैल्यू, भूमिका रिवाइज्ड वैल्यू के लिए नहीं होगा ये, तो आप रिवाइज हो जाएगा तो फिर गलत हो जाएगा, यू हैव टू इश्यू फॉर द डिफरेंशियल वैल्यू, जो आपने इनवॉइस रेज किया है और अभी आपने कम करना है, तो वॉट एवर इज द डिफरेंस, फॉर दैट यू हैव टू रेज अ इनवॉइस। तो आपने 18% चार्ज कर दिया, आपको चार्ज करना था 12%, सो यू विल रेज अ क्रेडिट नोट फॉर द डिफरेंशियल टैक्स विच इज 6%। वैल्यू कुछ नहीं होगा, वैल्यू कुछ नहीं होगा, बिकॉज देर इज नो डिफरेंस इन द वैल्यू, द क्रेडिट नोट विल बी ओनली फॉर द टैक्स, बिकॉज द वैल्यू इज करेक्ट, द टैक्स इज डिफरेंट। The quantity received by the recipient is less than what was declared in the tax invoice. You have raised an invoice for 1 lakh quantity, but the receiver says I have received only 90,000. Then you check और आपको पता चलता है कि हाँ invoice wrong है. So I have to give them the benefit. So for the 10,000 quantity, you will raise a credit note. And fourth instance, when the quality of the goods is not satisfaction of the recipient, therefore you are to give a partial or total reimbursement. There also you will raise a credit note. So credit note will be always issued by the supplier. A customer, generally in books of accounts, accounting term, we say, I give credit note, you give debit note, I give debit note, you give credit note. That is not the case in GST. Credit note or debit note, both will be issued only by the supplier. The receiver need not give anything in return. So this is not the accounting credit note, this is a tax credit note. So this will go only from the supplier's end because he will report it in his GSTR1. Okay. So credit notes will be always issued by the supplier, and it is not allowed for secondary discount. What we know, we have understood under valuation that the benefit of discounts is available if those conditions are satisfied. The conditions are that it should be mentioned at the time of issuance of invoice, or if it is issued later on, it should be agreed prior to the supply, prior to issue of the invoice. Before the supply, it should be agreed and it should be quantifiable. Only in such case you can give a post sales discount. But in case of a secondary discount, it is not satisfying the conditions of a credit note. So for the secondary discount, you can't issue a credit note because the tax benefit cannot be reduced from the supplier, and the receiver also need not reduce the tax. So that's why for a secondary discount, you cannot issue a credit note. For all other instances, you can give a credit. Clear? सो क्रेडिट नोट हम समझ गए। अब डेबिट नोट भी सिमिलर है। क्रेडिट नोट हमने बोला कि जब वैल्यू ज्यादा किया है उसको कम करने के लिए हम क्रेडिट नोट रेज करेंगे। डेबिट नोट ऑपोजिट है, जब मैंने डिक्लेयर इनवॉइस में कर कम कर दिया है लेकिन ज्यादा करना चाहिए था। द फर्स्ट इंस्टेंस, द सप्लायर हैज एरोनियसली डिक्लेयर्ड अ वैल्यू व्हिच इज लेस देन द एक्चुअल वैल्यू, इसको बढ़ाना है तो देन आई विल गिव अ डेबिट नोट। उसको अलग से नया इनवॉइस रेस करने की जरूरत नहीं है क्योंकि ओरिजिनल इनवॉइस ऑलरेडी रेस कर चुका हूं मैं, उसको अभी आप डेबिट नोट रेस कर सकता हूं या उसे मैं सप्लीमेंट्री इनवॉइस भी बोल सकता हूं। आई कैन कॉल इट एज अ डेबिट नोट और अ सप्लीमेंट्री इनवॉइस। सेकेंड इंस्टेंस, जब मैं डेबिट नोट रेस करूंगा, सप्लायर हैज एरोनियसली डिक्लेयर्ड लोअर टैक्स रेट। मुझे 12% चार्ज करना था, मैंने 5% चार्ज कर दिया है, तो फॉर दिस डिफरेंशियल ऑफ 7% मैं डेबिट नोट रेस कर सकता हूँ। थर्ड इंस्टेंस, when the quantity received by the recipient is more, मैंने इनवॉइस में 50,000 क्वांटिटी रेस किया लेकिन रिसीवर को मिला है फिजिकली 60,000, तो फिर वो 10,000 क्वांटिटी के लिए मैं एक डेबिट नोट रेस कर सकता हूँ। ठीक है, तो डेबिट नोट वैल्यू इंक्रीज करने के लिए, क्रेडिट नोट वैल्यू रिड्यूस करने के लिए। नाउ व्हाट इज द टाइम फॉर इश्यूएंस ऑफ दिस क्रेडिट नोट और डेबिट नोट? क्रेडिट नोट जो है, जो मैं इशू करूंगा उससे मेरा टैक्स कम होने वाला है, तो देर इज अ टाइम लिमिट। व्हाट इज द टाइम लिमिट? बाय द 30th November फॉलोइंग द एंड ऑफ द फाइनेंशियल ईयर इन विच द सप्लाई वाज मेड। जैसे मैंने जनवरी 2024 में सप्लाई किया है, तो कब तक मैं क्रेडिट नोट रेज कर सकता हूं? If I have issued a invoice on 25th January 24, if correct, so everybody is giving date of annual return. So it says 30th November following the end of the financial in which such supply was made. So let's stick on to this, right? Then I'll come to that. So yes, everybody is given a correct answer that 30th November 2024. So before that, you have to issue a credit note. Now, if I have raised the invoice on 1st of April, then what is the time limit for issuance of credit note? अरे बाप रे, सिर्फ 3 महीने के लिए मेरा 1 साल एक्स्ट्रा मिल जाएगा. जस्ट फ्रॉम जनवरी, फेब्रवरी, मार्च, 2 महीने बाद के इनवॉइस के लिए और सेइंग आई कैन इश्यू अ क्रेडिट नोट बाय नवंबर 2025 और जनवरी इनवॉइस के लिए और सेइंग टिल नवंबर 24 आई कैन रेज अ क्रेडिट नोट. श्योर है आप? यस, एवरीबडी इज श्योर कि 1st April 2024 to 31st May because November following end of the financial year. You're right. So just imagine that if you do anything in the beginning of the year, the correction के लिए you will get so much of time, right? So time limit for issuance of credit note will be 30th November following the end of the financial year or the date of furnishing of the relevant annual return, whichever is earlier. That is the time limit for issuance of credit note. एंड टाइम लिमिट फॉर डेबिट नोट में क्या हो रहा है, गवर्नमेंट को एक्स्ट्रा रेवेन्यू आ रहा है बिकॉज समथिंग विच यू मिस्ड आउट नाउ यू आर करेक्टिंग. तो उसके लिए गवर्नमेंट को कुछ दिक्कत होगा क्या? वहां पे गवर्नमेंट को दिक्कत नहीं होगा. गवर्नमेंट से ठीक है, कभी भी करना है आप कर दो क्योंकि मेरे को तो रेवेन्यू मिल रहा है. सो इट सेज देयर इज नो टाइम लिमिट. डिक्लेयर इन द मंथ ड्यूरिंग विच यू रेज द क्रेडिट नोट. जिस महीने में आपको मेंशन मिस्टेक मालूम पड़ता है उस महीने में आप क्रेडिट नोट रेज कर दो और you declare in that month's return. Next is tax collection and mentioning, which is there are two sections which says that prohibition of unauthorized collection. Section 32 is very important section. It says that a person who is not registered shall not collect in respect of any supply of goods or services any amount by way of tax. आप रजिस्टर्ड नहीं हो, आपके इनवॉइस में आप टैक्स चार्ज नहीं कर सकते हो. अगर आपको टैक्स कलेक्ट करना है तब आपको रजिस्टर्डेशन लेके रजिस्टर्ड पर्सन बनना पड़ेगा. सो इफ यू आर टेकिंग रजिस्ट्रेशन देन ओनली यू विल टेक द responsibility and the benefit of collecting taxes from your customers, वरना अपने customers से भी taxes collect नहीं कर सकते. Which means no registered person shall collect tax except in accordance with the provisions of the act. मतलब unregistered person cannot collect. Then section 33. Section 33 says amount of tax to be indicated in the tax invoice and other documents, notwithstanding anything contained in this act or any other law, where any supply is made for a consideration, then every person who is liable to pay tax for such supply shall prominently indicate in all his documents relating to assessment tax invoice the amount of tax which shall form part of the price at which supply is made. मतलब फर्स्ट में बोलता है कि आप रजिस्टर को तभी कलेक्ट कर सकते हो, दैट इज सेक्शन 32. सेक्शन 33 सेज अमाउंट ऑफ टैक्स शुड बी इंडिकेटेड इन योर टैक्स इनवॉइस. जो भी आप टैक्स कलेक्ट कर रहे हो उसे आपको इनवॉइस, डेबिट नोट, क्रेडिट नोट में स्पेसिफिकली मेंशन करना पड़ेगा. क्लियर अप टिल नाउ? Now we'll go to e-invoicing and compulsory QR code. But before that, let us take the statutory update in relation to this chapter so that we'll cover that and then come to the aspects of e-invoicing. Okay, there are only two updates which is relevant for us. Okay, on the e-invoicing, that is the first update, right? Wherein, with effect from 1st October 2020, e-invoicing was mandatory for all registered business with aggregate turnover in preceding financial year, which is greater than 500 crores. 500 crores को उन्होंने धीरे-धीरे नीचे लेके आ गए. Then with effect from 1st August 2023, it is reduced to 5 crores now. So 10 crores, I had told that somebody was asking a question whether it is reduced. Yes, for your post relevant year also, this got changed, which I thought it was 10 crores, but I stand corrected here that with effect from 1st August 2023, the limit for e-invoice is reduced to 5 crores. Thus, any e-invoicing has been mandatory for all registered person with an aggregate turnover in any of the years. So unlike other provisions where we say registration, you have to see annual turnover of the previous years and things like that. In case of e-invoicing, you don't have to see turnover of just the previous year. You have to see turnover from the date of GST, which is in 2017. So in any of the financial year starting from 2017-18, if your turnover is more than 5 crores, then from 1st August 2023, all your invoices has to be reported on the e-invoice portal. Okay, so the limit of 5 crores is applicable for you as well by notification number 10 of 2023. Then applicability of e-invoicing to government department, public sector undertakings, which is registered solely for the purpose of deduction of tax. Now there is a requirement of tax deduction by the government authorities that when you receive something, you have to deduct tax. But on the government authorities services, there is no GST payable, but they have to register under GST for what purpose? Only for the purpose of this TDS. So when they have to register for the purpose of TDS, will they be considered as a registered person liable for e-invoicing? There is a clarification for this, which says that the issue which arose for consideration was whether e-invoicing is applicable for supplies made by a registered person whose turnover exceeds the prescribed threshold for generation of e-invoicing to government departments, government agencies, and other things who are registered solely for the purpose of deduction of TDS. It is clarified that the government departments or establishments or agencies which are required to deduct TDS are liable for compulsory registration. Therefore, government departments do this registration. Okay. Accordingly, the registered person whose turnover exceeds the prescribed threshold for registration invoice is required to issue e-invoice for the supplies made to such departments. So when The government departments take a registration solely for the purpose of TDS. They are to be treated as registered person. Now, when you supply anything to this government departments, then you will have to raise a e-invoice only. Because when I'm raising e-invoice, I was doubtful whether should I raise a e-invoice to the government department also. Then the government department said, no, no, you don't raise a e-invoice for me because I'm only registered for the purpose of TDS. That issue went to the board, and the board has now clarified saying that, boss, you are supplying it to a government. Now government got registered, a government department got registered. So you raise a e-invoice for supplies what you make to the government departments also. So only those two are the clarifications with respect to this chapter. First is limit of e-invoicing reduced from 10 crores to 5 crores. And when you make any supply to government departments, even if they are registered only for the purpose of GST TDS, still they will be treated as a registered person and you will pay the GST on that. Okay. Now let's understand in detail what is e-invoicing. What do you understand by e-invoicing based on your readings and understandings? Invoice which is issued in electronic form, which means from my computer software, if I issue an invoice, that is e-invoice. And if I give manual invoice, that is a manual invoice. If I give from a computer software, that is a e-invoice. Is that what are you saying? Invoice which is in electronic form, invoice which is in electronic form, such as using software, invoice generated electronically. And where you have a QR code that everybody has. So if I raise an invoice, I want the payment in my bank account. So I will not give the bank account details. I'll give a QR code. So that will become e-invoice then. Am I understanding your responses correctly? You guys in line with me? Whatever you're saying, am I saying it correctly? Supplier create e-invoice and report to IRP. Okay. So which means e-invoice itself we have to understand in detail. I thought uh, since this is a revisionary class, you would have understood it, but okay, no problem. So at least gives me that we need to understand e-invoice much in detail. Just invoice which is issued electronically doesn't mean it's a e-invoice. You raise an invoice manually or you raise from a software. They are all both called as tax invoice itself. Just that instead of writing manually, you are writing it on the system. That's the only difference. But that doesn't mean that it is a electronic invoice or a e-invoice. It's an electronic document it's a manual invoice when you write it manually, and it's a electronic invoice when you raise it from the software. But that is not a e-invoice. What is e-invoice? Let's dwell into this. E-invoice का मतलब है, here we'll understand what is the invoice. Whether invoice generated by a software on the computer is an e-invoice? No. अगर सॉफ्टवेयर से आप जनरेट करते हो वो इलेक्ट्रॉनिक इनवॉइस हो सकता है, लेकिन उसे आप ई इनवॉइस नहीं बोल सकते हो. वेदर इनवॉइस जनरेटेड इन अ सेंट्रल सर्विस एन इनवॉइस? नहीं, वो भी नहीं है. E-invoice does not mean generation of the invoices from the central portal of a tax department also. तो फिर E-invoice क्या है? Invoice, firstly हमको समझना चाहिए प्रॉब्लम क्या हो रही है. Invoice generated by each software may look more or less the same, but they can't be understood by another computer system. जैसे हमारे जीएसटी सिस्टम है, जीएसटी पोर्टल को समझ में नहीं आएगा, तो फिर आपको पूरे इनवॉइस का कंटेंट फिर से जीएसटी पोर्टल को देना पड़ेगा. सो देयर इज अ डुप्लीकेशन ऑफ एफर्ट्स, करेक्ट. और आपको इनवॉइस फिजिकली कैरी करना पड़ेगा. और एक द इनवॉइस जनरेटेड बाय सैप सिस्टम कैन नॉट बी रेड बाय अनदर मशीन विच इज यूजिंग टैली सिस्टम. सो सॉफ्टवेयर में भी प्रॉब्लम होता है. एक सॉफ्टवेयर दूसरे सॉफ्टवेयर से हैंडशेक नहीं करता है, तो एक सॉफ्टवेयर में जो जनरेट होता है वो दूसरे सॉफ्टवेयर वाला देख नहीं सकता है. सो देयर इज नो सिंक्रोनाइजेशन बिटवीन दीज सॉफ्टवेयर, क्योंकि हर एक सॉफ्टवेयर का उसका अलग ही स्कीम चलता है. Likewise, there are hundreds of accounting and billing software. So data on such invoices cannot be understood by the GST system. Mainly क्या है, हम GST का बात कर रहे हैं, तो फिर GST सिस्टम को समझना चाहिए, लेकिन GST सिस्टम को समझ में नहीं आएगा, तो फिर वो क्या करेगा, फिर से डेटा फिर से मांगेगा. तो फिर क्या होगा, सेपरेट रिपोर्टिंग ऑफ इनवॉइस डेटा फॉर जीएसटी रिटर्न एंड ई वे बिल. तो आप मल्टीपल डेटा करोगे. एक जीएसटी रिटर्न फाइल करने के लिए डेटा एंटर करोगे, एक ई वे बिल के लिए आप एंटर करोगे अलग से डेटा. फिर बोथ हैव डिफरेंट फॉर्मेट्स एंड हेंस टैक्स पेयर हैव टू प्रिपेयर ईच टाइम सेपरेटली. आपको ई बिल रेज करना है तो आप रेज करोगे अलग से, जीएसटी रिटर्न के लिए फिर से अलग डेटा रेज करोगे, क्योंकि इन दोनों का फॉर्मेट अलग है, करेक्ट. Then the format of reporting in GSTR1 and that for e-way bill also is different. GSTR1 में डिफरेंट है, 3B में डिफरेंट है, ई-वे बिल में डिफरेंट है. तो फिर आप एक ही डेटा को 3 बार रेस करोगे. और जैसे आपका टाइम पीरियड अलग अलग होता है, एरर्स भी हो जाएगा. लॉट ऑफ एरर्स क्रीप इन मैनुअल प्रोसेसिंग. सो अनस्क्रिप्टलेस एलिमेंट्स जनरेट फेक इनवॉइसेस. सो मेन रीजन है कि ये मैनुअल इंटरवेंशन की वजह से आपके इनवॉइसेस, सो सेम इनवॉइस है वो अलग अलग डेटा पॉइंट्स पे, GSTR1 में, GSTR3B में, ई वे बिल में अलग अलग डेटा हो सकते हैं. गलती से या इंटेंशनली भी गलती हो सकता है. और मेन रीजन है कि जब भी जीएसटी आया है तब से एक फेक इनवॉइसेस का बड़ा प्रॉब्लम आ गया है कि पीपल आर रेजिंग लॉट ऑफ फेक इनवॉइसेस और पुश देम इन द जीएसटी सिस्टम कि मैंने सेल किया है, जीएसटी नहीं पे करेंगे और भाग जाएंगे. दे विल क्लोज डाउन देयर बिजनेस. क्योंकि GSTR1 में जब मैं रेस करके दूंगा सामने वाले को क्रेडिट तो मिल जाएगा, तो सामने वाले को क्रेडिट फेक क्रेडिट हो जाएगा, क्योंकि आई हैव नॉट सोल्ड एनीथिंग, लेकिन उसको तो क्रेडिट मिल रहा है. तो वो क्रेडिट लेके ही विल टेक द क्रेडिट एंड सप्लायर GST1 रेस करके भाग जाएगा. सो व्हाट इज हैपनिंग, ये सभी प्रॉब्लम्स को कंट्रोल करने के लिए, जो जेन्युइन प्रॉब्लम्स है और जो फेक प्रॉब्लम्स है, इन सबको कंट्रोल करने के लिए ई इनवॉइस लेके आ गया. So users of software would not find any change since they would continue to see the physical output of the invoices in the same manner. So इन सब के लिए e-invoice लेके आ गया. What is e-invoice? E-invoice system being implemented across the globe consists of two important parts. One is generation of an invoice in a standard format. जो अलग अलग फॉर्मेट है उन सबको हटा के एक स्टैंडर्ड फॉर्मेट में लेके आएंगे, so that the invoice which is generated on one system can be read by another system and it can be read by the GST system also. और कैसे, how will this be there? Everybody will report it in a central GST system. GST एक सिस्टम देगा, उसमें आप रिपोर्टिंग करोगे. So you will report it off the invoice to the central system. And reduction of manual data. How manual data will reduce? Once you raise a e-invoice, that data will get transmitted to e-way bill. That data will get transmitted to GSTR1. From the GSTR1, that get transmitted to GSTR3B. तो आपका मल्टीपल डेटा एंट्री, मल्टीपल डेटा पॉइंट्स से बच जाओगे और एक ही जगह आप ई इनवॉइस रेज कर दोगे, देन यू डोंट हैव टू गिव दैट डेटा टू मल्टीपल पीपल और मल्टीपल टाइम्स। एक ही बार आप ई इनवॉइस रेज करोगे, वो डेटा जीएसटीआर 1 में भी सेव हो जाएगा, ई वे बिल में भी पुश हो जाएगा। So that manual data entry leads to the following: transaction errors, wrong entries, need for standards, elimination of need. That is the disadvantage of manual entries. E-invoicing में आपको सभी जगह, सभी एक ही जगह हो जाएगा। Applicability, earlier 500 crores था, फिर 100, फिर 50, फिर 10. Now it is 5 crores. For what all transactions you have to raise a e-invoice? For all B2B supplies, business to business supply, B2G supplies, business to government supplies, for our all our export sales, supplies which is made through e-commerce, supply on which reverse charge is transactions are there. So basically on all B2B, B2G, एक्सेप्ट B2C आप देखिए हर सप्लाई आ गया है यहाँ पे। सो एनी एक्सपोर्ट्स के ऊपर भी आई हैव टू रेज अ ई इनवॉइस। सो B2B, B2G exports, supply through e-commerce operators, and supply on which reverse charge is payable by the recipient. All of that I will report it in the e-invoicing portal. So it means it is not applicable for what transactions? On import of goods and import of services, it is not yet there, because it is should be controlled by the supplier. लेकिन import of goods में receive services में you're a recipient, तो इसीलिए वहां पे जी ई इनवॉइसिंग अप्लीकेबल नहीं होगा। अपार्ट फ्रॉम दैट, जैसे मैंने कहा कि सप्लाई ऑन विच रिवर्स चार्ज इज चार्ज्ड, एंड सो आई गिव ए एग्जांपल, नाउ यू टेल मी सो दैट विल क्लैरिफाई हियर। देयर इज अ एडवोकेट, फर्स्ट इंस्टेंस is he is not registered and he provides bill to me. Okay, so should I pay GST under RCM? And who will raise the invoice for this? So recipient who will pay and raise the invoice. Correct. So हमने समझ लिया है. So I am a receiver. I will raise an invoice. I will raise a payment challan, payment voucher, and I will pay reverse charge. ठीक है. Now second instance, the lawyer is registered and he is supplying legal services to me. Now in this second scenario, who will pay the tax and who will raise the invoice? Correct. Lawyer will raise the invoice and recipient will make the payment of the reverse charge. Correct. So you have understood this clearly. No confusion in that. So doesn't mean that if the lawyer is unregistered, we'll pay. If the lawyer is registered, we will not pay. If the lawyer is registered, still we will pay it. Correct. So that is reverse charge. So in this case also, when the first instance lawyer was unregistered, we will pay reverse charge. E-invoice is not applicable because supplier should push the e-invoicing. In the first instance, lawyer was not registered. In the second instance, lawyer is registered, so he will raise a invoice and he will raise it if they crosses the limit of 5 crore rupees, then he will raise a e-invoice. So once he raises the e-invoice, then we will pay reverse charge. You will anyways continue to pay the reverse charge, but in this case, e-invoice will be raised by the lawyer because that it says supplies on which reverse charge transactions are attracted. That will also be under the e-invoice. So not necessary that on all e-invoices supplier will pay the tax. If it's a supply on which reverse charge is applicable, then the supplier will raise the invoice, raise a e-invoicing also, but tax will be paid by the recipient. So person receiving supply on which he will pay the tax, but he will not raise a e-invoice. Clear? Okay. Applicability of e-invoice, what all documents? Invoices, debit note, credit note. That's all. Invoices, simple. Invoices, credit note and debit note on our delivery challan, bill of supply, job work charges, no applicability of e-invoice, only on invoice, debit note, and credit. Exemptions for e-invoice, following people don't have to raise the e-invoice. Special economic zone units. So it says only SEZ units. But if it's a SEZ developer, then he will have to raise the invoice. A SEZ unit is one which is within a SEZ doing some activity. But SEZ developer is one who does the complete structure. He's a developer of a SEZ who is built that SEZ, maintains the SEZ, upkeeps the SEZ. He's a SEZ developer. SEZ unit are those factories or manufacturing units within a SEZ. So on that units, e-invoice is not applicable, but for the developer, e-invoice will apply. Insurance or banking company or financial institution, for them also e-invoice is not applicable. GTA supplying services in relation to transportation of goods, not applicable. Supplier of passenger transport service, because they're giving only tickets, for them also the turnover will be very huge. Like the bus company, one of the government organizations, BMTC, the Bus Transportation Corporation in Bangalore is called BMTC. They will have turnover of crores together. So for them, they will just issue tickets. For them, e-invoice will not applicable. Person supplying services by way of admission to exhibition or cinematographic films, film theaters and multiplex, for them also not applicable because they're just giving a ticket. Don't burden them with so much. Okay. Then a government department and local authority. So these are the 6 category of people on which e-invoice is not applicable. Okay. Now, when these people are exempted, they have to give a declaration in their invoices. They have to say that I hereby declare that though our aggregate turnover in the preceding financial year is more than the aggregate turnover notified under 48.4, we are not required to prepare an invoice in terms of the provisions of the said sub-rule. So provision of that 48.4 says that even though your turnover crosses the threshold limit of 5 crores, these 6 category of people need not raise a e-invoice. So that declaration they have to give on their invoices. So of course, on the tickets like passenger transport, the ticket itself is so small, they will not give. Wherever they're issuing an invoice, normal tax invoice, there they will give this declaration. Okay. Now, what is the process of e-invoice? E-invoices will be created by the taxpayer on their own accounting ERP system. The e-invoice will be reported on the invoice reference portal. So what will the taxpayer do? He'll raise an invoice on his accounting software and then he will push that from his accounting software to a invoice reference portal. There is an invoice reference portal. There he will send the data from his accounting software. Then the invoice reference portal will generate a unique invoice number called as invoice reference number. IRN will be generated from the IRP, from the invoice reference portal. Whatever data you give, a IRN is generated, which will be attached on the e-invoice and system will digitally sign the same and return to the taxpayer. So you'll get an invoice from the e-invoicing portal along with the invoice reference number. Okay. Then the IRP will also generate a QR code. It will have a IRN reference number. It will have the details. Then it will have a QR code. Once you scan the QR code, what you will get? You will get all of these details. GST of the supplier and recipient, invoice number as given by the supplier, date of generation of the invoice, invoice value, number of line items, HSN code of the main item, and unique invoice reference number. It will be a big number, which will be called as a invoice reference number. That is the important number. QR code will enable offline verification. Why QR code is there? So that whenever you want to check, you can check it. Whenever the tax officer want to check the details, he can check it. A taxpayer can continue to print his invoice as being done earlier, but he will have to mention this IRN number in this, or he can use the invoice which is getting generated from the e-invoicing portal, and he can use that as an invoice. Both of them is fine. Now, from the e-invoice, what is getting generated, what data gets auto-populated? Your GSTR1 data will get auto-populated, because this data is what is the sales data, and in your GSTR1 also आपको sales data ही डालना है. तो फिर आपके IRN से आप GSTR1 में data automatically आ जाएगा. So your GSTR1 of invoice before clearing goods from your factory gate. Correct? So before movement of goods, you will raise an invoice, which means before delivery, before removal of the goods, you have to raise a e-way bill also. So once you raise a e-invoice in the e-invoice portal, the data will get automatically fetched to the e-way bill. In the e-way bill, part A will be filled, and part B are transporter's details that e-invoice doesn't know. So that you will have to manually fill the details of the transporter, that is the vehicle number, and from where to where you are getting the goods moved. So then the person responsible, that is the is getting filled, no data mistakes. GSTR1 is also getting filled, no data mistakes. E-invoice, GSTR1 and e-way bill with match with each other. Cancellation, is it possible? You can cancel the e-invoice within a time limit, which is just 24 hours. If you raised the e-invoice, you can cancel it within 24 hours. After that, you cannot cancel. So I've done a mistake in e-invoice. What do I do? No worries. From e-invoice, data has gone to GSTR1. GSTR1 data, you can correct it. E-way bill, if you don't want to generate, that also you can amend it. So amendment of the e-invoice not possible because the timeline is only 24 hours. You can cancel it. But the data, once getting finalized e-invoice, it goes to the GSTR1. In the GSTR1, you can make the corrections. How does the system work? This is the system called as e-invoice system. You have to have a login ID and password. You have to generate it. Once a login password is there, you'll go to the e-invoice generation, enter the details. Okay. What is your application name, trade name, address, mail ID? First time you have to do this. Once you do this, then you come to the main portal of e-invoice and other things. We will go to the e-invoice. This is a major one. E-invoice entry form, you will mention whether it is B2B, B2G, which is B2 government, B2B is B2 business, or export. Mention the category, whether regular or reverse charge, or through an e-commerce operator. Document details, which is invoice, debit note or credit note. Then the invoice number, date of the invoice, transaction type, bill from, which is your entity where you're billing from, bill to which entity you're billing, item details. Basically, all the details of the invoice will come here because it's a e-invoice. So all the invoice details has to come here. Once that comes in, then you will print the, once it is fetched, then the e-invoice gets printed, which will, this is the long number, which is called as IRN number, acknowledgement number. This QR code is there. All the details, B2B supply, GSTI number of the supplier, GSTI number of the receiver, all the description, HSN, and all the details of the taxes and everything comes in. Okay, so this is how the e-invoice gets generated. Backend, how does it work? The seller uploads invoices on the invoice reporting portal. The e-invoice registrar has 3 registrars, and then from there, the GSTN system works as a hash stored in GST invoice registry, which does deruplication is checked. It checks all the systems and pushes it to the buyer so that buyer can check it. And in the e-invoicing, from the e-invoicing, GSTR1 and the e-way bill also gets pushed in. And this e-invoice is getting generated. What are the advantages? Auto-reporting, correct? Because in your GSTR1 and e-way bill gets auto-reported. It reported in multiple forms, GSTR1, e-way bill, and 2A. Helps in reduction of transcription errors. See, one place I've written something, other place could be a different thing. So such errors are reduced. It will facilitate standardization, system level matching of input tax credit, and most importantly, it will eliminate the fake invoices. Why? Because in normal cases, you will just report in GSTR1, but once you have crossed the threshold limit of 5 crores, you are compulsory required to report in e-way bill, in e-invoicing. So once you report in the e-invoicing, it will know from where the e-invoicing has been raised, and invoices gets reported. So later on, you cannot cancel it. Correct? So that's why e-invoice will help in reduction of fake invoices. And because the data of the e-invoice goes to the GST department. So once the government sees that through the system analysis saying that every month you're raising 10,000 rupees invoice, this month you have raised a 5 crore invoice. What is the matter? So they will immediately investigate into it. Then bulk uploading of invoices to IRP is also possible. Then CBSE clarified that when you are raising an e-invoice, there's no requirement to carry that original, duplicate, triplicate. There's no requirement to carry the physical copy of invoice. Just you print the QR code, that is sufficient, because from the QR code, everything will be visible to the taxpayer as well as to the tax officer. Now, what does that QR code will give you? Upon successful registration, it will return a signed e-invoice. Once you scan the QR code, it will give you a e-invoice itself with the invoice reference number and the QR code. It will get generated. Now that is on the e-invoicing part. Now e-invoicing is applicable only to B2B, nothing to B2C. The limit is 5 crores. Then they came up with another system called as dynamic QR code, wherein if they are making any supplies to B2C. So for B2B, we have e-invoice. Now for B2C also, to support them, they're saying B2C invoices issued by a person whose aggregate turnover is more than 500 crores. So they're only talking about big companies, because here e-invoicing we have only 5 crores, and this is for 500 crores turnover ka company. It is very big company. You have multi-level transactions. Okay. So if you are having a big company, so you are capable of doing anything. So your turnover is more than 500 crores. In any of the preceding years from 17, 18, you should have a QR code on your invoice. Now, this QR code is not the QR code what we spoke on e-invoicing. This is a separate QR code. What is this e-QR code? This QR code will be a purpose of having a dynamic QR code is to facilitate digital payments so that whenever the customer scans, they can make the payment. So to encourage this digital payment, this dynamic QR code is there, which says that when you are making any supplies from business to end customer, that is who's not registered, then you will have to have a dynamic QR code जो customer scan करके उसको payment कर सकता है. A taxpayer can generate QR code for B2C invoices using their own QR code generating system. उसके लिए अलग से सॉफ्टवेयर, अलग से ई-वे बिल या ई इनवॉइसिंग की तरह पोर्टल नहीं है. आपका जो पेमेंट का रेफरेंस डालना है, that you will have to mention here, where the dynamic QR code is not displayed on the invoice, but the supplier makes available to the customer an electronic mode of payment like UPI collect or other things, that is also sufficient. Okay. So main objective, this dynamic QR code ka, like capturing the information nahi hai. This is giving information to the customer so that they can make the payments. So badi companies, Reliance or Adani's and things like that, they will see that उनके इनवॉइसेस में बड़े छोटे कुछ भी हो, in that invoices you will find a QR code. You scan that and you can make the payment. Now that scan, if it is not fitting in the invoice or it is not available in the invoice, but alternatively, if they are giving you a QR code, that is also sufficient. The invoice shall be deemed to comply with the requirements of the dynamic QR code if alternative way also you're giving them the QR code. So E-invoice 5 crores, dynamic QR code 500 crores. Now this dynamic QR code, like few people said, will not be applicable for us. Who are they? Same insurance or banking company, GTA, supplier of passenger transport services, person supplying service by way of admission to cinematographic films, and additional दो चीजें ऐड की है. One is supplier of online information database access retrieval services. Who are these services? When you give online information access, जैसे online में you give books, online you serve some data, some softwares you give. So there you don't, it's not necessary that you give a dynamic QR code. And even for exports, okay, very interesting. They've said B2C because, yeah, Netflix is a good example for OIDR. And export services. When you're making export, it is an unregistered person, but it is going outside India. That's where they've said even in case of export services, QR code is not required. Okay, so dynamic QR code, very small. Value is like very big, 500 crores, but content is very small. Unlike our e-invoicing, where the volume is 5 crores only, but so much of content. So that was simple and clear understanding of this chapter of tax invoice. Since this was mostly theoretical, there was no scope for preparation of MCQs in this. But on this dynamic QR code, also there is a various options which they mentioned in the study material. Basically, they're saying that if you're not generating it in the invoice and if you're giving alternatively, it is valid. Yes, multiple scenarios they've said. Yes, all of that is valid. Any questions on this tax invoice chapter? We are just waiting for 2 minutes. If there's any questions. Okay. Thank you, Om Krishnan. Thank you, Arjun. No doubts. That's wonderful. So please do revise for the next session. And if there's any queries on this chapter or the next chapter, I'll be able to assist you there. Thank you. Thank you, Swati. Thank you, Arjun. Thank you, Om Krishna. See you in the next class on Sunday. Thank you, Bhumika. Session complete. Yes, sir.